On February 1st, 2003, 16 days before that morning, the crew of Space Shuttle Columbia was already flying aboard a spacecraft that was never going to return home. NASA knew it. An engineer named Rodney Rocha wrote a letter to management with a direct warning that the wing could fail during atmospheric re-entry. The letter was never sent. The 7 people in orbit never learned about it and continued carrying out their mission until the very morning of landing. This is the story of 16 days during which dozens of people on the ground argued, ran calculations, requested satellite imagery, and were turned down, while a spacecraft carrying 7 astronauts slowly approached the point from which only a vehicle without a hole in its wing could return alive. Everything that follows comes from the Columbia Accident Investigation Board report, published in August 2003, and from the testimony of engineers who appeared before the board under oath. Nothing you are about to hear has been invented or reconstructed for dramatic effect. Everything is documented, verified, and confirmed by the independent investigation conducted after the disaster. Chapter 1: The Launch and the Shadow of STS. 112. On January 16, 2003, at 10:39 a.m. Eastern Time, Space Shuttle Columbia lifted off from Launch Pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center. It was the orbiter's 28th mission and the 113th flight of the Space Shuttle program. On board were 7 people: Commander Rick Husband, pilot William McCool, mission specialists Michael Anderson, David Brown, Laurel Clark, and Kalpana Chawla, along with Israeli astronaut Ilan Ramon, a colonel in the Israeli Air Force. The mission was designated STS-107 and was dedicated entirely to scientific research. 16 days of continuous experiments, 2 alternating crew shifts, and more than 80 research projects in physics, biology, and material science. At 81 seconds into the flight, as the shuttle was traveling at about Mach 2.5, a piece of insulating foam, approximately the size of a small suitcase, between 53 and 69 centimeters long, broke away from the external fuel tank. The foam struck the leading edge of the left wing, where the surface was made of reinforced carbon-carbon material about 5 millimeters thick. On the launch footage, the impact appears as a cloud of white debris bursting away from the wing. To understand why almost no one reacted seriously to that impact, we need to go back 4 months. In October 2002, during the launch of Space Shuttle Atlantis on STS-112, a similar piece of foam broke away from the same attachment point on the external tank, the bipod ramp, and left a dent about 8 centimeters deep in the metal attachment ring of one of the solid rocket boosters. That was metal, not the fragile carbon-carbon leading edge of a shuttle wing, yet the impact still left significant damage. Program management reviewed the incident during the next flight readiness review and decided not to classify it as a flight anomaly. Instead, it was treated as an engineering issue that could be addressed later. The planned fix for the foam problem was postponed from one mission to the next, and by the time STS-107 launched, not a single technical change had been made to the external tank. The history of foam shedding during shuttle launches did not begin with STS-112. The first documented case occurred back in 1983 during STS-7, and similar incidents had happened dozens of times since then. After one of those incidents during STS-50 in 1992, an internal NASA investigation reached a clear conclusion. Foam loss was considered an accepted flight risk and not a threat to flight safety. That wording remained almost unchanged in report after report. Out of 79 shuttle launches for which usable launch footage exists, foam shedding was observed in 65. Every time it failed to cause a catastrophe, The problem was considered less serious in NASA's documentation until it eventually became just another routine item signed off during flight readiness reviews with little discussion. There was more behind that decision than engineering overconfidence. NASA was facing a strict external deadline. The agency had committed to Congress to complete Node 2 of the International Space Station by February 19, 2004. That deadline had been announced back in 2001, in response to criticism over cost overruns and schedule delays in the ISS program. Any delay to a single shuttle mission would push back every launch that followed. One of the investigation reports described it in simple terms. Time and engineering resources were devoted to problems believed capable of causing the loss of a shuttle. Foam was not considered one of those problems. More than 100 launches had experienced similar foam strikes, and none of them had ended in disaster. Safety specialists refer to this phenomenon as schedule pressure. It is the point at which deadline pressure gradually changes the way an organization evaluates risk. A dangerous assumption begins to look like a reasonable engineering decision, simply because the alternative would be stopping the entire launch schedule. Chapter 2: Engineers against the system. The day after Columbia's launch, on Friday, NASA engineers reviewed the launch footage in slow motion, a standard procedure after every launch. One of them, Rodney Rocha, a structural engineer at Johnson Space Center, saw the impact and became concerned. He wrote a letter to the program managers asking whether something should be done immediately, before the thermal protection specialists left for the long Martin Luther King Jr. Day holiday weekend. He never received a reply. The following Tuesday, the debris assessment team met to evaluate the damage. Rocha was one of its members. The team had very little to work with. The camera that should have provided a clear image of the impact was out of focus because of outdated optics and reductions in the ground imaging staff. The investigation would later identify this as a separate contributing factor in the failure to properly assess the damage. Of the 5 launch camera locations, only 3 captured the impact, at least partially, and none captured it completely. Without a clear image, the team was left with an older software tool called Crater, a mathematical model originally calibrated to calculate impacts from pieces of ice and foam hundreds of times smaller than the one that struck Columbia. According to the board's later analysis, Crater assumed debris approximately 400 times smaller than the actual piece of foam. In other words, the tool was simply not capable of accurately evaluating an impact of that size. The engineers understood this. That is why they decided to request images of the damage from US Department of Defense reconnaissance satellites. NASA already had working channels for making such requests from previous programs. The request was made informally through personal contacts between NASA engineers and Department of Defense officers, bypassing the official approval process. Don McCormack, manager of the Mission Evaluation Room, briefed mission management on the situation, but did not insist that the request be treated as a mandatory requirement for continuing the mission. Since the request was never officially designated as mandatory, the Department of Defense had no formal reason to continue working on it. When flight management learned that the request had no official status, Linda Ham, chair of the mission management team, cancelled it. The reasoning was simple. Since the engineering team had not officially identified the damage as a flight safety threat, there was no formal justification for urgent satellite imaging. At the same time, Ham was preparing to become the integration manager for the next shuttle mission, STS-114, and any delay to Columbia would have directly affected the flight schedule. During the 9-day mission, several attempts were made to obtain satellite imagery through different channels. Each one was either cancelled by management or became lost in confusion over who was responsible for formally approving the request. The images were never taken, not during the first week of the mission and not during the second. Rocha's team was working under what he would later describe as proof that it's dangerous. In other words, the shuttle was considered safe unless someone could provide direct evidence that it was not. Without images, proving anything was impossible. On January 24th, the 9th day of the mission, the team presented its conclusions to management. According to the crater analysis, the thermal protection system had sustained damage. However, based on the available data, there was no evidence that it posed a threat to flight safety. Later that same week, Rocha drafted a letter addressed directly to senior shuttle program managers. It contained one sentence that would later become well known. In my humble technical opinion, the decision not to request additional imagery is incorrect and borders on irresponsibility. He never sent the letter. He later explained that he was afraid of breaking the chain of command. Going over the head of his immediate supervisor would have meant publicly questioning the judgment of higher-level managers without having anything more than his own technical concern to support his position. Years later, Rocha would say that this became one of the greatest regrets of his life. He did not force the issue. He did not go all the way to the top. He did not make thousands of NASA specialists stop and take the problem seriously while there was still time. If you've ever sat in a meeting knowing that your colleagues were making a decision based on incomplete information, but stayed silent because you didn't want to step outside your authority, tell us in the comments what you would have done. In this case, that silence cost 7 lives. And as you'll soon see, the line between "it's not our responsibility" and "we could have stopped this" was far thinner than anyone realized. Chapter 3. Life aboard a doomed spacecraft. Throughout this time, life aboard Columbia continued as a normal work rotation. The crew was divided into 2 teams, the red team and the blue team, which worked and slept in alternating shifts, allowing the scientific experiments to continue uninterrupted throughout all 16 days of the mission. Commander Rick Husband was a US Air Force colonel and was flying in space for the 2nd time. Back home in Houston, his wife and 2 children were waiting for him. Pilot William McCool had served as a US Navy test pilot before joining the astronaut corps and was making his first space flight. He had 3 sons. Michael Anderson, the payload commander, was a US Air Force lieutenant colonel. He had previously flown to the Mir space station in 1998 and was one of the few African-American astronauts at NASA at the time. At home, his wife and 2 daughters were waiting for him. David Brown and Laurel Clark, both US Navy captains, were flying in space for the first time. Clark left behind an 8-year-old son. Kalpana Chawla, an engineer from the Indian city of Karnal, was the only crew member who had already been in orbit before. She was responsible for crystal growth and combustion experiments in microgravity. Laura Clark conducted medical and biological research, including experiments involving prostate cancer cells, just one of dozens of scientific projects that were the reason this mission had been launched. Ilan Ramon's story has a separate chapter of its own. It rarely appears in technical accounts of the disaster, but it explains exactly what this mission meant to him. His mother and grandmother had survived Auschwitz. Shortly before the flight, he visited Israeli physicist Yehoyachin Yoya Yosef and noticed a tiny Torah scroll on his bookshelf, no larger than the palm of a hand. Yosef told him that in 1944, Rabbi Simon Dasberg had secretly brought that scroll into the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Using that scroll, Desberg conducted Yosef's bar mitzvah, while other prisoners covered the windows with blankets so the guards would not notice. At the time, Desberg told the 13-year-old boy that he himself would most likely not survive. He asked him for only one thing: survive, and tell the world what happened here. Ramon asked for permission to take that Torah scroll into space as a symbol that the promise made in Bergen-Belsen was being fulfilled, even in orbit. Commander Husband, for whom faith also played an important role, consulted a rabbi before the mission so that Ramon would be able to observe the Sabbath and keep kosher while aboard Columbia. Those arrangements became part of the crew's normal daily routine. On January 21st, during a live communication with Earth, Ramon held the scroll up to the camera and told its story. It became one of the most widely published images of the entire mission. The scroll was still aboard Columbia when the shuttle broke apart. It was never found. On January 23rd, the 8th day of the mission, Flight Director Steve Stitch sent Husband and McCool an email with the video of the foam strike and a brief note. Similar incidents had occurred on previous flights and had never caused damage to the thermal protection system. There was no reason for concern. Husband shared that information with the rest of the crew. That was the end of the discussion. For the astronauts, the issue was closed. There were still 9 days left before landing. On January 27th, Columbia's crew spoke by radio with the 3 astronauts aboard the International Space Station, which was passing in a nearby orbit. It was an ordinary conversation. They exchanged impressions about life in orbit and joked about weightlessness. None of the ISS crew knew about the debate that was taking place at that very moment between NASA engineers and shuttle program management on the ground. That conversation shows better than anything else the distance between what the crew knew and what the people on the ground knew. The distance was measured not in kilometers, but in the decision not to tell them. At the same time, the crew continued carrying out the scientific program. Students from 6 countries had helped prepare many of the experiments. Spiders from Australia, silkworms from China, ants from the United States, fish eggs from Japan, all were being observed in microgravity alongside experiments on flame physics and crystal growth. One of the biological experiments involved tiny nematode worms sealed inside airtight aluminum containers. A few weeks after the disaster, 5 of those containers were recovered from the debris field in Texas. In 4 of them, the worms were still alive. They had survived the destruction of the shuttle and an uncontrolled fall from an altitude of tens of kilometers. Part of the film recorded aboard Columbia was also recovered undamaged. It showed the crew smiling during one of their final work shifts in orbit. There is not a single sign of concern in those images. If you enjoy documentaries that explore stories like this in depth, this is the perfect time to subscribe. Next, we'll examine the telemetry from Columbia's final minutes and the official conclusion of the investigation into whether NASA had a chance to save the crew if different decisions had been made earlier. That conclusion is often repeated incorrectly. Here, you'll hear only what is supported by the investigation's official findings. Chapter 4. Re-entry. On February 1st at 8:15 a.m. Houston time, Columbia began re-entry over the Pacific Ocean. Landing at Kennedy Space Center was scheduled for 9:16 a.m. At 8:44, the shuttle entered the denser layers of the atmosphere. Superheated gases, reaching temperatures of nearly 1,500 degrees Celsius, began flowing around the damaged leading edge of the left wing, the exact spot where the foam had struck 16 days earlier. The breach in the wing allowed the hot gases to enter its interior, where there was no thermal protection. At 8:53:46, traveling at nearly Mach 23 and an altitude of about 70 kilometers, the shuttle crossed the California coastline. At that moment, observers on the ground saw bright flashes for the first time in Columbia's incandescent trail. Small fragments of the wing were breaking away and burning up in the atmosphere. Over the next 23 seconds, 4 more flashes were observed. At 8:54:24, the Mechanical Maintenance, Arm and Crew Systems officer reported to the flight director that 4 hydraulic sensors in the left wing had dropped below their minimum limits. In other words, they had effectively stopped responding. Until that moment, the re-entry had appeared completely normal. The shuttle passed over Nevada, Utah, Arizona and New Mexico, continuing to break apart as observers on the ground watched bright fragments separating from the main trail. At 8:58:20, Columbia entered Texas airspace. At that moment, it lost another thermal protection tile, which would later be found near the town of Littlefield. It became the westernmost piece of Columbia ever recovered. At 8:59:15, the flight director was informed that pressure readings had been lost from both left landing gear tires. At 8:59:32, Mission Control asked Commander Husband to confirm those readings. Husband replied, "Roger, The transmission ended in the middle of the sentence. Those were the last recorded words ever received from the crew of Columbia. Less than a minute later, at approximately 9 a.m., the shuttle broke apart at an altitude of about 60 kilometers over eastern Texas. The wing, stripped of its thermal protection, could no longer withstand the aerodynamic and thermal loads. Communication with Mission Control was lost completely. Capcom Charlie Hobaugh called the shuttle twice. Columbia, Houston, comcheck. There was only static. At that very moment, the families of the astronauts were already standing in the viewing area at Kennedy Space Center, waiting for the landing that was supposed to take place 16 minutes later. The investigation concluded that there was no explosion in the conventional sense. The crew cabin separated from the disintegrating orbiter and then broke apart under extreme aerodynamic and thermal loads over the course of several tens of seconds. The exact time of death for each crew member could not be determined. However, according to the board's analysis, cabin depressurization, the first unsurvivable event in the sequence, occurred no later than 9:59 and most likely even earlier. None of the astronauts had time to close the visors on their pressure helmets. This indicates that the depressurization happened too quickly for any protective action. Debris and human remains were scattered across more than 5,000 square kilometers of eastern Texas and parts of Louisiana. Thousands of military personnel, volunteers, and local residents joined the recovery effort. The search operation was coordinated from Barksdale Air Force Base in Shreveport. Over the following months, approximately 84,000 pieces of the shuttle's structure and thermal protection system were recovered. That represented about 38% of the orbiter's total mass. Some of the crew members' remains were identified through DNA analysis. The search for debris did not end when the official recovery operation was closed. In 2011, a severe drought exposed the bottom of Lake Nacogdoches in Texas. Part of one of Columbia's onboard propellant tanks was discovered there, 8 years after the disaster. Chapter 5. Could they have been saved? One of the most difficult questions the board addressed separately was this: did NASA have a chance to save those 7 people if the wing damage had been recognized as serious immediately after launch? The answer was yes, at least in theory. The board asked NASA to study 2 possible scenarios, assuming the extent of the damage had been identified during the first days of the mission. The first option was to repair the damaged wing while still in orbit. The specialists concluded that it was technically possible, but extremely risky. There was no certified repair material on board capable of surviving atmospheric re-entry. The only option that was seriously considered was to remove intact thermal protection tiles from other areas of the orbiter, reshape them by hand, and literally pack them into the hole in the wing's leading edge using tools and metal fasteners from the emergency equipment kit. Because of the fragile nature of the reinforced carbon-carbon material and the unpredictable behavior of such an improvised repair under re-entry conditions, the board concluded that the chances of success were low. The second scenario involved launching Space Shuttle Atlantis on a rescue mission. Atlantis could have been prepared for an emergency launch and sent to rendezvous with Columbia to evacuate the crew, while the orbiter still had enough oxygen and other life support consumables. The board described that scenario as complex but achievable. Under the most optimistic launch schedule, Atlantis could have reached Columbia during the final days before the orbiter ran out of life support resources. NASA had approximately 2 weeks to recognize that the damage was serious and begin preparing that rescue plan. That never happened, because the damage was never recognized as serious. Chapter 6: The Investigation and the Normalization of Deviance. The investigation was led by the newly established Columbia Accident Investigation Board, chaired by retired Admiral Harold Gehman. In addition to him, the independent board included military pilots, NASA engineers from other programs, and aviation accident investigators. Its technical conclusion was straightforward. The piece of insulating foam that broke away during launch breached the leading edge of the left wing. During re-entry, superheated gas entered through that breach, destroyed the wing's internal structure, and led to the loss of control and the breakup of the shuttle. Among the board's final recommendations was a requirement to make on-orbit inspection of the shuttle a mandatory part of every mission. It was the very requirement whose absence had cost Columbia's crew their only real chance to learn the true condition of the damaged wing. But the board did not stop at the physics of the foam strike. A separate chapter of the report was written by sociologist Diane Vaughan, who had spent years studying the 1986 Challenger disaster. She found an almost identical pattern of decision-making. In both 1986 and 2003, engineers identified a technical risk before the accident. In both cases, they tried to bring it to management's attention. And in both cases, management decided to continue the mission because a similar anomaly had occurred before and had not led to a catastrophe. A few hours after contact with Columbia was lost, President George W. Bush addressed the nation. He confirmed what had already become clear from the debris scattered across Texas. Columbia was lost. There were no survivors. That same day, NASA Administrator Sean O'Keefe contacted the US Navy to establish an independent accident investigation. The board was assembled within 90 minutes of the disaster. The investigation called this phenomenon the normalization of deviance. It is a process in which an organization gradually expands the boundaries of acceptable risk, simply because previous cases of that same risk did not end in disaster. The board's final conclusion was uncompromising. NASA's organizational culture played as much of a role in this disaster as the piece of foam itself. The systemic weaknesses that had led to the loss of Challenger 17 years earlier had still not been eliminated by 2003. Only the setting and the names of the managers had changed. Since then, the concept of normalization of deviance has been applied far beyond the space program. It has been used to explain the failure of the levees in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, the Boeing 737 MAX accidents. Each case followed the same pattern. The warning existed. People heard it. And every time, someone decided that because nothing had happened before, nothing would happen this time either. If this story resonated with you, tell us in the comments whether you've ever seen an organization choose the comfortable version of events over the uncomfortable truth. How did it end? Stories like this don't happen only in space. They happen in factories, in hospitals, in offices, and almost always for the same reason. It's easier to ignore an engineer's warning than to explain to management why the schedule has to change. Chapter 7. After the disaster. After the disaster, the Space Shuttle program was suspended for 2.5 years. The 3 remaining orbiters, Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour, underwent both technical and organizational changes. The design of the external tank attachment area was modified. A mandatory on-orbit inspection of the shuttle was introduced, using a 15-meter inspection boom with cameras mounted on the end of the robotic arm. In addition, every mission was assigned a standby shuttle that could be launched on a rescue mission if serious damage was discovered in orbit. Separately, in 2003, NASA established the NASA Engineering and Safety Center. The new organization was given the authority to raise technical concerns directly with NASA leadership, bypassing the shuttle program's normal chain of command. The very chain of command that had silenced the engineers' concerns in January 2003. Space shuttle flights resumed in July 2005. During the very first mission after the return to flight, STS-114, launch footage once again showed a large piece of foam breaking away from the external tank. This time, no damage occurred. Even so, NASA grounded the shuttle fleet once again, simply to make sure the lesson had been fully learned. The Space Shuttle program officially came to an end in 2011, after construction of the International Space Station was completed. One of the reasons was the board's conclusion that the shuttle's fundamental design carried unavoidable risks. The crew flew alongside an external fuel tank capable of shedding debris toward the orbiter during every launch. The families of the crew, along with Rodney Rocha himself, later testified before the investigation board. 7 asteroids discovered in July 2001 were later named after the 7 members of Columbia's crew. In Amarillo, Rick Husband's hometown, the city's international airport was renamed in his honor. The promise connected to the Torah scroll from Bergen-Belsen was ultimately fulfilled by another family. In 2006, a similar Torah scroll belonging to another child who had survived the same concentration camp was carried into orbit aboard Space Shuttle Atlantis. It was an attempt to complete the journey that Ilan Ramon never had the chance to finish. Conclusion. Tell us in the comments which part of this story surprised you the most. The technical story about the foam strike? The satellite imagery that was never taken? The 2 weeks that were lost? Or the story of the Torah scroll that traveled from a concentration camp to orbit and, in a way, back into the skies over Texas? On this channel, we tell stories like this because disasters are rarely just a collection of facts. They are usually a chain of decisions, and somewhere along that chain, there is almost always a moment when everything could still have been stopped. If you enjoy documentaries like this one, subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation.